Step 8. Willing to Amend. A presentation by Robert P. Hello, my name is Robert P. and I am a grateful member of Nar-Anon, though I speak today as an individual and not as a representative of Nar-Anon. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the 3 actions I took when I worked my most recent Step 8. First, I built my list of harmful interactions. This is a continuation of the work I did in Step 4. Then I categorized my list. Finally, I became willing. I did not act on my list, I simply became willing to act. In my video on Step 4, I said the list I built there would be used in Step 8. Some members put a lot of work into a detailed Step 4 list. Some wait until Step 8 to expand their Step 4 list. It does not matter when the work is done, as long as I have a completed list by the time I finish Step 8. I need a list of which behaviors I used, how they caused harm, and who was affected. I'll illustrate this process. I begin with my list of personality traits from Step 4. I select one or more which I have used in ways that caused harm. For example, I sometimes feel like a martyr. Then I blame my internal feelings on someone else, and I hold on to that feeling by feeding a resentment. Next, I want to examine these selected behaviors. Resent, blame, and martyr. I know I use these behaviors with 2 of my loved ones. I'll call them J and M. A couple of years ago, I worked with J on a research project. I've not fully dealt with my resentments towards J. I also have lingering resentments towards M because of our broken relationship. I blame both J and M about various money issues. That's enough for now. First, I just identify who belongs on my list and why. I did the same exercise for others, and we'll get to them later. If I focus on J, I can list some specific actions. For example, my behaviors, my language, my attitude toward J. I also need to add myself to this list. After all, my own thinking is harming me. As I thought about my amends list for J, I realized I had done the same things before with a friend named R. I did steps 8 and 9 with R many years ago. Yet here I was repeating myself, doing the same thing yet expecting a different result. On examination, I realized I was not as much blaming as I was grieving and harboring anger. What I did in my amends to R was tell him about my changed behaviors, apologize only for my wrongs, listen to him, forgave myself, and accepted the situation. But also set a boundary that I would never let him do the same thing to me again. I'll tell you more about this in a few minutes. As I examined my anger, I thought about my neighbor. I already described much of my thinking about my neighbor in my video on Step 2. In that case, I was not grieving, and I had enough program time so I did not think of myself as a martyr. Even so, amends were due. In my Step 2 video, I touched on the key points of my amends to my neighbor. My prompt amends to my neighbor illustrates how the program works. I do not need to wait until I have time to do a deep cleaning. Being willing is not an annual event. As you work the steps, being willing becomes part of your lifestyle. I described my willingness to amend with my neighbor in my video on Step 2. I described my initial response and later closure with M in my video on Step 4. Next, I want to examine my behaviors with why. One day, I went out to get some frozen yogurt. Y and I had a disagreement regarding food safety. I did not behave with anger. I did not speak with anger. I do not think I owe Y an amends. But the situation bothered me. I could have added Y to my Step 8 list and waited until some later day to think about Step 9. Instead, I acted promptly. I tried to release my daily resentments and anger before going to sleep each night. When I left the yogurt shop, I sat for a few minutes and thought through the 12 steps. 1. I realized I was powerless to change the way he runs his shop. 2. I believe the county health inspectors check regularly, so it's not up to me to police his operation. 3. I decided to simply walk away. 4. I know the chaos in my own head is of my own making. 5. I admitted my self-generated chaos to my higher power and now to you. 6. Once I admitted my thinking to my higher power, I became willing to change. 7. I humbly asked my higher power to help me release my frustrations. 8. I examined myself openly, trying not to preclude a possible amends. 9. I apologized to the inner child in me who wanted a yogurt. 10. I acted promptly. 11. I took this as an opportunity to check in with my higher power and put a check on my own ego. 12. And now I'm sharing this incident with you. Well, no yogurt, but it was an interesting diversion. So getting back to my step 8 list, the next person to add is C. C and I were friends. Well, I thought we were friends. Actually, she used my time and my money while lying about me. My sponsor helped me understand the only amends owed here is to myself. Next up is S. I liked S, but again, I was just getting played. She liked letting me open opportunities for her, but had a violent history. Eventually, her violent nature was directed toward me. These interactions helped me latch onto the slogan, "No is a complete sentence." And that gets us to R. I briefly mentioned R earlier. I think this is a good time to explore my amends to R as an example of step 9. My summaries regarding my amends list are very abbreviated. I'm only listing a few highlights in my summary on each. R is an example of a situation where I can elaborate a bit. R and I had been friends in school. R landed a good job, and when they needed another worker, he recommended me. Unfortunately, I had more experience than he did at the time, so I started with a larger salary than R was making. I was also ahead of R in competition to be a corporate partner. R plotted to discredit my work. I discovered the plot. I was hurt. Rather than fight a friend, I took a job elsewhere. Remember, however, this is a simplified version of this tale. Many years later, I was working on a step 8 list. At that time, I was digging deep, and I thought of my old friend R. I put him on my list. I traveled to where I had last seen him. I checked around until I found him. We got together. I said I was sorry I'd broken off our friendship so harshly. He was as well. Then he told me a tale. He'd become a partner. He invested everything he had into the company. Then the executive partners cashed in, closed the company, and took all his money. We talked a bit about our past, then we parted. I did not fix our friendship with my amends. All I did was get closure. And that was what I think we both needed. Life is not a fairy tale. Our stories do not all have happy endings. The point of an amends is healing. Heal the relationship where appropriate. Heal ourselves where possible. One key is to release our resentments. There's a Narayan saying about this. Remember, all people are always changing. When we judge them, we judge on what we believe we know of them, failing to realize that there is much we do not know and that they are constantly changing as they try, for better or worse, to cope with life. Well, now, getting back to my amends list. Fortunately, I am not limited to just one page. The first entry on this new page is for G. G and I had an unpleasant phone call a few months back. I did not yet know what I want to do about this situation, so I simply add G to my step 8 list. I'll think more about this later. J is a relative. As I become more accepting of others, I be adjusting my behaviors towards J. The next person on my list is myself. The biggest amends I am making to myself is to change my behaviors. I have a lot more work to do here, but I cannot do everything at once. And that is my step 8 list for this year. It's shorter than typical because I try to stay current. I try to resolve everything I can promptly. I also repeat this process every couple of years so I do not have a big backlog of unresolved issues. For example, I resolve my distress about why promptly. On occasion, I stop and think through the 12 steps like I did with N. Sometimes I throw a slogan at the problem, then take time later to think through the steps, like I did with M. When appropriate, I just avoid all contact, like I'm doing with S. Occasionally, the best I can do is just practice tolerance, like I'm doing with C. As for J, G, and I, step 8 just asks me to build a list and become willing. I am willing. But today is not the day to do step 9. Let's examine the words of step 8. Made a list. You can make a list with only the name of the person you just encountered. You can spend a few months examining your behaviors and build bigger lists. Please, however, do not spend an extended time on this. Instead of unraveling your entire life story all at once, do what you can. Then come back later and do it again, and again, and again, until this is part of your everyday life. Of all persons we had harmed. Obviously, this means the people you physically hurt, also the people you verbally assaulted, and the people you simply wished had suffered and you still resent. Focus especially on the damage you caused to yourself. And became willing. Again, a reminder. In step 8, all you need to do is make the list and become willing. Making the list is hard work. Becoming willing is equally hard and deserves time and consideration. To make amends. When we get to step 9, we can look at this in more detail. For now, simply make the list. Amends do not require you risk your physical or mental health. You can make amends without ever encountering the other person. To them all. You can make amends by writing a letter that you never mail. You can make amends by journaling the event. I'm not trying to give you an easy way out, but too many of us in the Anon programs take too much responsibility. I've attempted to explain my part in arguments with some of my friends, only to discover they had no memory of the situation. Step 8 simply asks us to be willing. The list I developed for this video is short because I filter out some of my encounters as I go along. I use step 8 together with step 9 as part of my life framework. They're defenses against the challenges I encounter in my journey through life. Please indulge me as I tell you a tale. I want to describe an analogy. Imagine life as a river that tends to overflow its banks on occasion. My first line of defense against these calamities is the slogans. I use the slogans to build new responses to old triggers. Sponsors and friends often have a stockpile of slogans they can share. The defense I use when it can take longer is to quickly walk through the 12 steps in my mind, or I write them down. When I started this habit, it took me an hour or longer. With practice, I'm faster. I gave you an example of my analysis with all 12 steps earlier in this presentation when I talked about frozen yogurt. Your sponsor can help you with this. My best, most solid defense is this program, the whole 12 steps in depth. I can withstand almost anything with this program. I might get bowled over, but I can get back up and try again. Before we move on, have you heard the joke about the truck, the boat, and the helicopter? I'm going to tell you my variation on that old joke. A person saw the river rising. A truck filled with slogans pulled up, but he didn't want any slogans. He knew his sponsor would rescue him. The river kept rising, and a boat came along. The boat was filled with notes about all the steps. Again, the man turned away. He knew his sponsor would rescue him. The river kept rising, so he retreated to the top of a mountain of workbooks. A helicopter came along and offered even more workbooks. He said he didn't need any more workbooks. He knew his sponsor would rescue him. He was forced to tread water for a while. Finally, the river receded and he got to a phone. He irately called his sponsor, demanded to know what had happened. Why hadn't his sponsor rescued him? His sponsor calmly explained. He sent a truckload of slogans. He sent a boatload of step studies. He even sent a helicopter filled with workbooks. We provide tools so each individual can rescue themselves. In summary, I started examining my personality traits in Step 4. By the time I finished Step 8, I have a deeper understanding of how I applied my behaviors, my language, and my thoughts towards those around me. During this time, I examined my personality traits, how they were used, and who I affected. I then built a list. I added everyone onto this list, including myself. I then put these people into groups. There are some I plan to make amends with when I get to Step 9. Some I already did everything I planned to do. One I'm willing to talk with towards closure if she's willing to talk, and one I plan to permanently avoid. At this point, you really should talk with a sponsor or a friend who understands the program. For example, I wanted to have a deep conversation with C regarding the friction between us. My sponsor helped me understand that I cannot take 100% of the responsibility. As we talked, he helped me understand that I was not the one lying, I was not the one taking money under false pretenses, and I never said anything unkind, though she said plenty to me. My sponsor helped me practice using my hula hoop. What is inside my hula hoop is my responsibility. What is outside my hula hoop is beyond my control. I then changed my plan regarding C. If we should meet up sometime, I will endeavor to start a conversation. Should the opportunity arise, I will say I am sorry our friendship ended so abruptly. And that is it. That just leaves 4 people on my list. M, G, J, and me. And that leaves me with the question of what should I do? The answer to that is primarily to have patience. Wait for higher power to provide clarity. Wait for higher power to provide opportunity. And wait until I get to Step 9. As for myself, well, I can practice changed behaviors on a daily basis. I can forgive myself for my mistakes. And I can put myself up onto my Step 9 list. I've mentioned having a sponsor several times now. In my opinion, you can do Steps 1, 2, and 3 by working with friends in your group. I believe you should have a close confidant when you work Steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. You need to be able to trust this person because you'll be sharing a lot of personal information. This person could be a priest, a therapist, a close friend, or a sponsor. Steps 8 and 9 are complex. These are core steps in our program. You really need someone looking over your shoulder on this. And whoever that is, it should be someone who has done this before. A tour guide who knows the route. You really need a sponsor on Steps 8 and 9. Steps 10, 11, and 12 are spiritually focused. While the entire program is based on a spiritual connection to a higher power, Steps 10, 11, and 12 work best if the person helping you on your journey is consistently focused on their own journey. I strongly recommend you find a sponsor by the time you get to Step 8. Altogether, you might be surprised at how much you grow while working Step 8. I'll close now with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.